Thank you so much, everybody, for coming out. My name is Suzanne McDonald, and I'm the board president and co-founder of Ciro's Montessori School in Portsmouth, Rhode Island. Joining us also from the board is Erin Sullivan, who is another one of the co-founders, and Ann Devaney, who's also a board member. We have Miss Pamela from our primary pre-K kindergarten program, and a couple friends who are coming in from Nevada and elsewhere and planning to move to Newport this summer and interested in Ciro's. We have our special guest, Whitney Slade from Riverbend School, who has a lot of experience as a head of school and recently has jumped ship over into the Montessori world. I forget who suggested that I reach out to you, Whitney, but I think it was someone through the Martin Luther King Center, of which you're the board president there, had suggested that we connect. And you live in Newport. Newport's your home turf, but you are the head of school at the Riverbend School in Natick, Massachusetts. A little bit about Whitney. He has a master's in education from Harvard University Graduate School of Education and has spent many years as head of school at traditional private schools and is also, as I said, the board chair at the Martin Luther King Jr. Center. And a little bit about Ciro. We're going into our 6th year next year, and we have a primary program and an elementary program. Next year, elementary class will be going up to 4th grade, but our goal is to get to 8th grade. We are certified by Department of Ed and the Rhode Island certification for childcare centers, which is done through DHS. Now, we are super excited to have Whitney join us and share his experiences in Montessori and get to share his expertise with you.
Thanks, Suzanne. I always think it's really exciting to support a young school because I think those are the schools that get us to pivot and change and look at how we do things. Riverbend, the school that I run now, is entering its 12th year. It was a merger of 2 Montessori schools, which is fairly common in the Montessori world is merged. So it was a merger of a children's house, which is a toddler and primary and an elementary program. I've been here 5 years. I came in after spending 17 years running 2 different, what I would call more traditional independent schools. Pretty progressive schools, but compared to a Montessori environment, very different. I'm not a Montessorian. I'll say that right up front. I'm not a trained Montessori teacher. All our teachers are Montessori trained. And that's something that in every Montessori school is pretty much the way it should operate is that, and I know Ciro's is that way as well. Montessori training is very in-depth. It's interesting. In the public sector, you're certified K through 6. That's typical. I actually got that training way back in my early teaching career. And the way Montessori does it is it's in increments of 3 years. So for example, if you're a primary teacher, trained to do 3 years, 4 years, and 5-year-olds, that's your training. If, for example, you move up and you switch to lower elementary, which is 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade, you have to get retrained. And to me, that is profound. And it really shows the degree of expertise that your children are getting when they're working with those teachers. And a lot of it has to do with learning the materials. It's very hands-on. It's very manipulative. The materials are usually almost all wood. They're gorgeous. It's beautiful for the kids to interact with. And these materials lend themselves to how kids learn. It's just phenomenal. Now, as a non-Montessori, I cannot tell you how to use the materials, but I can tell you as an educator that intuitively I can look at a child using these materials and wow, they just work. So it's beautiful and it just meets the children where they're at. Just a couple of short things about Montessori that I really like, and then I'm happy to answer any questions. I think one of the big things that struck me was the intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. And so In many traditional schools, there are extrinsic sort of motivators for kids. There's less choice. There's often assessments. There's often grades. I had multiple conversations with kids in my past two schools about what are you learning? And they would say, I got an A. And I said, well, what did you learn? And to me, that's the better question. It's not what you got, it's what did you learn? And our kids in a Montessori program, you almost never hear that question. You always hear them talk about what they are learning. And there's so many misconceptions about Montessori. I didn't really understand it completely when I came in. So I did a tremendous amount of observation of our teachers and our kids, because observation is a huge part of Montessori, the teacher observing the child and helping them, chart their path. I think a lot of people think that Montessori is very loosey-goosey. It's actually really incredibly structured in a very non-traditional. There are no desks. You will not see rows of desks. You will not see a teacher standing up in front of the kids lecturing, but you'll see kids and teachers deeply engaged in lessons in smaller groups, meeting children where they're at. And kids are doing it because they are being supported by the teacher to them and their learning. And a lot of things with Montessori is around the children's house. I believe strongly that if Riverbend goes up through eight, so it's 18-month-old through 14-year-olds. I believe it works just as well if you continue on that path. And the big difference I see in our graduates, the graduates versus the graduates of the two more traditional schools that I ran, Riverbend graduates, they are still incredibly curious, super excited about learning, regardless of where they go to high school. They're still with it. A lot of kids from traditional schools sometimes are a little burnt out. Ooh, a lot of tests, a lot of homework. Montessori does have that, but it's very different. And it allows kids to really follow their passions. They get all the skills that they need. There's no skill deficits I've seen. Their thinking skills are far more advanced. I think I said this to Suzanne when we were talking previously. I've had more really interesting conversations with kids at Riverbend just about incredible topics and things that they're doing than I ever had at the past two schools that I ran. And I tend to be a head that's very much out talking to kids all the time. I will say the Riverbend kids, they're highly verbal, and that's encouraged in a Montessori school. So I'm happy to answer any questions that people have specific to Montessori or about some of the things that Montessori presents that maybe another kind of traditional education is not.
It's really fascinating. And I'm just putting up some pictures of Ciro's just to give a sense if anyone's not familiar with what a Montessori classroom looks like. You mentioned no rows of desks. So there's different materials around the room. This is a pre-K classroom, big focus on collaboration, also individualized learning. A guide will go around and check on students in elementary. There's a lot of lessons that are done in groups and that everybody breaks away from the group with different tasks that they're interested in or how they're going to apply the lesson to their learning, which is really fascinating. I really wanted Whitney to come on and talk to us because he has this vast depth of experience in a traditional, private school setting that has become a Montessori convert. The University of Virginia had an article that came out that talked about outcomes, right? What are some of the outcomes? Because one thing is you want your child to have a good education, but you also want them to be a good and well-adjusted human. How does that render into adulthood? And the University of Virginia did some pretty significant research in this area and tells that it's one more data point. This is a quote from Forbes magazine, a growing body of research suggesting Montessori is better for humans than is the common model. And it's over 100 years since people began implementing Montessori. It has been beta tested. We know how to implement, and we are doing so all over the world. So more people should know about it. And I thought, oh, what better than to have Whitney come and talk to us about his experience because he's seen both sides from a educational leadership perspective. So one question is, if there was one thing that you could pick that you like best as compared to traditional school, what do you think is best about Montessori?
I really like the whole thing about the humanistic part of it. There's a sense of, and this is throughout the school, whether I walk into children's house or the older kids, there's a joy and purposeful sort of noise in the room about learning. It's very interesting. You can go around the school and you very rarely hear the teacher's voice. It doesn't mean that there's not a tremendous amount of guidance going on, but it's really about the child guiding their learning with real experts watching them do that. I'd go into a classroom in my other two schools and everything would stop. And they would say, "Good morning, Mr. Slade," which is not what I wanted. But I go into a class here and it's almost like they don't notice me because they're so engaged in what they're doing. Um, I gave a tour to a primary family a couple years ago and I could see their faces. They really were having a hard time envisioning why this was. They said, "This is amazing. The kids are all focused, but they're all focused on their learning in different ways." If you see a mission statement from most independent schools, there's always this thing called joy of learning and lifelong learning. In Montessori, I don't think you would need to say that in your mission statement because it is so replete and embedded in what kids do every single day. So it sounds cliche, but really the best part was just watching kids learn in a way that's just, as an educator, incredibly fascinating and powerful. So that was definitely one of my favorite pieces of being in a Montessori school. There's an energy and a calmness at the same time, which is a little bit of a odd juxtaposition, but it really works. That energy to be learning. So the other thing about Montessori that's great is if children are working on something, they don't have to stop. They can leave it. And everybody knows to leave it there and not disrupt it. They can come back to it. To me, that's emblematic of what we're asked to do in what I call the real world is you're not given 45 minutes to finish the task and then have to switch and do something else. What the workplace is demanding these days is flexibility and ability to pivot and work with others. These are all things that are just embedded in a Montessori education because the workforce that these kids are going to go into, we don't even know what it's going to look like. Um, that's the point I made about Montessori kids pivoting. They're able to pivot because they've been taught to think for themselves, which is super powerful.
I think future proofing is really important, but also it's interesting because there are some videos out there and some research out there that shows that Dr. Montessori was so ahead of her time. And now that they can do brain scans and look at neuroscience, it just goes to show that she was really onto something. All the evidence supports these things. And I just think it's really fascinating. But in some ways, if you think of her scientific background, it's not all that surprising. She spent her life refining all these practices and skills and methodologies so that it would work for children, and in particular worked with disadvantaged children from the beginning. So I think that that is really fascinating how it's proven to play out. It's not that different from when she was first starting out or when she was getting Montessori going, right? There were pandemics going on and world wars and all these things, and Montessori speaks to that in terms of the methodology as well. I was just curious if you've had that experience also in terms of where we're headed and maybe not necessarily politically, but as far as what students are going to need to know to be able to adapt.
With the older kids, there's lots of discussions going on about the pandemic, sort of the social upheaval that is in some parts of the country pretty evident. I think one of the things that's really good about Montessori is it doesn't tell you the answer. It tells you how to think about arriving at an answer that's supported well and well thought out. The other piece of it is there's a thoughtfulness to it. In this environment, it's all about instant gratification. You got to have the answer, got to have the answer now, got to be right. Montessori does not do that. It gets you to slow down, it gets you to think. and arrive at thoughtful answers because you've spent time thinking about it, researching. To me, that's just how kids learn better. They don't need to be revved up in school. They don't need to be an accelerated pace. The pace of the world when they leave is very accelerated. If the pandemic has taught us anything, it's that the social emotional needs of children are equally, if maybe not more important than what they learn. The thing I love about Montessori is that those two things have been hand in hand since the beginning. Maria wrote a lot about why kids need to be respected as learners. Geography is a huge piece of Montessori. And obviously, geopolitics is a big piece of that. So the kids do understand from a very early age the global connectedness of the world. Every grade does different projects every year, international festivals. So there's a ton of exposure to other cultures, geographies. So that's, again, another piece of Montessori that's really, I think, unusual.
What are some common traits that you see in Montessori students? Are there any other traits or skills that you think translate well into adulting?
They're observant, they're good at reflecting. And I think those kind of things add to their ability to be thoughtful and actually what I would call flexible learners. Because they've been in charge of a lot of what they learn and guided by teachers, there's a flexibility in their thoughts. I look at it in our country today and everything's black and white. You're either this or you're either that. I think it's very important for kids to be able to appreciate obviously differences, but nuances of thought. There's a great cognitive flexibility that I think that Montessori, because it's intrinsic and because it's innate, they're already like that. For example, in a traditional kindergarten, big open rooms with play spaces and water tables and things. And then you hit first grade, and then as you get older, it just gets more narrow when it should be getting bigger and bigger. So Montessori doesn't squeeze the learner as they get older. It actually expands their ability and their skill levels to be cognitively flexible. And that is going to be super necessary.
I know social emotional learning is a big catchphrase too, that I think seems to be catching on, especially in pandemic times. What are your thoughts on how Montessori addresses social emotional learning?
I don't believe social emotional learning should be taught as well, now we're going to go to
Yeah.
SEL class. It's like teaching study skills in isolation. You don't teach study skills in isolation. You teach study skills as part of the process of learning. There's a phrase in Montessori called grace and courtesy. You don't say it all the time because if you say it every time, then it becomes cliche, but it really is embedded in how teachers work with kids. There's conflict resolution built in to Montessori. It gets kids to talk to one another about how they're feeling, especially if they're having difficulty with a peer. That's a huge piece of the program. And again, it's embedded into the philosophy and how the teacher handles things and how the teacher puts the onus back on the child to resolve their difficulty or their conflicts with somebody else. There's a big piece of Montessori called practical skills. Kids are taught to do things for themselves. My first week at Riverbend, I'm walking down the hallway. It's a November morning and the kids are, taking off their coats and taking off their boots. And I bent down to help this child struggling with their boots. It was a primary student. And the teacher came up to me and said, no, let them do it themselves. So there's this real emphasis on not doing something for kids that they can do themselves. Whereas as adults and educators, we immediately swoop in and try to solve and help kids when they're perfectly capable of doing it themselves. And that is a big piece of, especially the Children's House Montessori primary toddlers. They're very self-sufficient. Self-advocacy is very big with the older kids. How to advocate for your learning wherever you go, because they're not going to be Montessori their whole life.
My daughter's 9, and I've recently gotten a lot of feedback talking about how she's able to articulate what her needs are. And then the other point of feedback that I got from another educator was how she packs and organizes her own stuff. If we're going away for the weekend, we're going skiing, she's got her bag packed, check it, make sure there's a toothbrush in there. But for the most part, a lot of it is self-initiated. She's excited, she wants to go, she knows what she needs. It's pretty exciting to be able to do that, and that at 9 years old, that you're able to be independent, and I think that's a huge piece of adulting, to not step in when you're not really needed, I think is important. So, thoughts on Montessori school accreditation? Do you need to find a Montessori school that is accredited?
A yes and no, because the accreditation process is the school has to be in existence for a fair number of years before they can become accredited. So there's two large accrediting bodies in the United States. There's American Montessori, AMS, and then there's AMI, which is more of an international accreditation. AMI is it's a very strict adherence to the original tenets of Montessori. Riverbend is not an accredited Montessori school. We are members of AMS. We participate in their professional development. So it is not necessary. But one of the things that I would say is it's really important to understand the training process for the teachers. If they're not trained or gone through an approved Montessori training, then that, to me, at least up in Massachusetts, I don't know about Rhode Island, but there's been several Montessori schools that have made the news in the last months, not for the right reasons. So the name is Montessori, but they're not really truly Montessori schools. So the ones that we are with are accredited by an outside organization, not always Montessori. Some are dual accredited, have both. We chose not to do that because of our middle school. The middle school is a little different. It's a transitional program because they're going to traditional high schools. But we're a pure Montessori program up through sixth grade. So the answer is yes and no. But to me, it's about the training of the teachers.
Montessori is not trademarked, let's say, or copyrighted. So, really, what you need to look for is the qualifications of the teachers. And that's really what I would look for at C-Rose. Our teachers are all certified, trained Montessori teachers. And a couple questions have come in, some military families coming in for war college. And one thing that a lot of military families who have been in, the reason why they like Montessori is because when you go from place to place, the philosophy is the same. I know in my family, my brother and my sister in law are Coast Guard, and they're sending their second kid through the academy now. But when the first one was, they were moving from New Orleans to DC and back and forth, it was a challenge because the education wasn't the same. The oldest one, I think, suffered the most, from having that transition between schools, and that's one reason we have a family who's come from Japan, and the Montessori is the same in Japan as it is here, or India, or anywhere else in the world. But to look at the certifications of the teachers is the number one thing, because you could be Montessori accredited and not all have the certified teacher. Other question too is, Riverbend, how does it handle students who don't have prior Montessori experience?
So we have kids coming into the school in first grade, third grade, fifth grade. And that's a very common question from parents. My child has never been in a Montessori school. Will they somehow be disadvantaged or behind? And the answer is, in my experience and having observed this, is definitely not. They're fine, because what happens is the kids come in and they're suddenly feeling, wow, I really get to own what I'm learning here. And I still believe that's because that's the sort of innate way kids learn. And I've heard the phrase that Montessori isn't for everybody. I actually believe that there's very few kids that it wouldn't be good for. I think if a family has a mindset that they don't want their kids to own their learning, then if it's a type A situation, then that's fine. But we have kids that will be super successful kids because of the way they've been educated. So the other great thing about Montessori is you don't have to leave a part of yourself when you walk in the door of a Montessori school, because everybody is embraced for that. So it's not like you've got to hide something or leave a part of your personality or leave a part of your learning style. So there's a real emphasis on inclusivity, respect for differences. DEIJ or DEIB has been a catchphrase for what's becoming all over the place. Montessori's had a component of social justice in it for years, and it's part of the training of the teachers.
Yeah, I love that. So just with this picture up, I think might be a good time to talk about mixed age classes. What are your thoughts on that?
So if you're not familiar with Montessori, every grouping of students is in 3-year groupings. So in primary, you have 3, 4, 5, and 6-year-olds. So you have kindergartners at the end of the 3rd year. If they stay, go into lower L or elementary, it's first, second, and third. And then upper elementary is 4, 5, and 6. So if a child stays in a Montessori school for that long, they have 3 built-in opportunities to be leaders. So the older kids are very much seen as leaders, seen as role models, seen as being responsible for the other kids in the room. Actually, the younger kids very naturally look up to the older kids. In some cases, it actually accelerates their learning because, especially with emerging readers, they're in a room. So if you're in a room of first and third graders, you've got emerging readers and very developed readers. If you're in a primary room, there are some kids who are pretty advanced in their literacy skills. It could be reading very well in kindergarten. We have kids who are reading 2 or 3 years above grade level, and they can be in a room and that mixed it. So for example, if you have a second grader who's a really good reader, they don't have to read the same book as ever. So for example, in your traditional school, everybody reads the same book. All right. We don't have to worry about that. There's a big saying about meeting the child where they're at. And the 3-year cycle does that. At every level, you're in the beginning, the first year, you're learning the system of the room. The second year, you're comfortable. And then the third year, you're expected to be a leader and a role model. So the 3-year cycle is, again, if you're looking at judging Montessori schools, if they don't have a 3-year cycle, then it really isn't adherent to Montessori.
I would say too that if you have a student who's struggling, an older student who's struggling, they're not sitting there feeling like I'm the only one who's not getting this. There's a natural built in. Everyone is learning, everyone's on their own and learning at different paces. So I think it really de-emphasizes that stress that I think kids feel like, why am I not getting this? And that comparison that I think you see naturally happens when you're in a room of 25 kids and everyone gets it but you. What does that leave you feeling like? Whereas the mixed age and the Montessori philosophy in general make it like we're all in our individualized path of learning. So I think that's fantastic.
Some kids are stronger in one area than others. So they can excel in that one area they're strong in, and they're allowed to maybe struggle a little more longer in areas they're not, in a way that's supportive. And it actually, I think they can grow faster in that regard.
What do you think is unique or different or notable about Montessori teachers compared to traditional educators in a regular environment?
One is their training level. It's in some ways like getting a master's degree in education. The training can last a long time. And if you switch, as I said before, you have to retrain. One of the pieces of Montessori in the training is observation. So the teachers are highly tuned into observing the learning of children, how the kids interact with one another, their sort of social and emotional daily routines and how that works out. I think the reason that the rooms are calm and are more reasoned is because of the teachers. So there's not this urgency of the teachers. Everybody's got to be on page 36 in the workbook by the end of the month. There just isn't this sort of, they're guiding the journey, and the teachers instinctually know that the journey is not the same pace for every kid. But what I would say is all the kids get there. It's just that it's not necessarily at the same time. And the teachers are very comfortable with that. So there's a calmness and thoughtfulness to teachers that are a little different than about a Montessori teacher, for sure.
So what about when I am sending my student to a Montessori school, how can I tell if it's working based on what's coming home? And what if you could talk about maybe what it might look like for pre-K, primary kindergarten versus an elementary? What do you see or what do you hear from parents in terms of is it really working?
This has all been thrown into the hopper in the last couple of years because of the pandemic. We've really been, there's been a implied trust with parents that it is working because they really haven't been involved in the school. Prior to that, to me, it's the relationship between the teacher and the parent knows it's working because the teacher can say things about their child and how they're learning. They can be very specific and extremely detailed about the skills that the child is developing. And you don't have to be an educator as a parent to understand that. Every school communicates differently. There's so many ways that schools communicate with parents, but I think in a Montessori school, typically there's a lot of daily interaction with parents and teachers, and there's a comfort there. And there's a trust that I think is backed up because the teachers are so articulate about how their child learns. For example, I'll sit in meetings at the end of the year and I'll listen to the teachers as they pass from division. So if they pass from primary to elementary and they go through each child and where they are at skill levels, where their reading is at, where their math is at, where their sort of social emotional growth is at, it is powerful. I jokingly say to our teachers, we should record this and put it out to parents. And they would say, oh my goodness, this is unbelievable how well they know the child and how they're learning. And they know what they need to pass on to the next level for their strengths and their weaknesses and their challenges. So it's, to me, that's the difference.
If you're not familiar with Montessori, you would traditionally stay with the same teachers in the same classroom, the primary. So that would be 3, 4, 5, 6-ish-year-olds, right? Through kindergarten and then in elementary, first, second, third grade. And at Sea Rose, our elementary teacher is certified up to sixth grade. We're very excited to have that stability of resources. And it was interesting at my last parent teacher conference, we were talking about our elementary teacher was an assistant in primary. So she has experience when these students were very young, 4, 5, 6 years old, and now they're 9. The oldest ones are 9 going on 10. So it's pretty exciting to see that evolution and to see that your teacher knows your child so well is super, super helpful. I can't imagine what it must be like to have to change a new teacher every year. It just sounds like chaos. My last question is, what are some of the major differences that stand out between Montessori and traditional for a parent or a caregiver?
I would say in general, Montessori parents are very willing to engage in the process of learning with their child and the school. I feel like there's just this willingness to share the journey. If they don't know a lot about Montessori, they at least know enough to know that it is really important to allow their child to develop at the pace that they're supposed to be developing. If you push a child too fast too soon, then they're not picking up the skills they're going to need. They're not making that foundational understanding of whatever the skill is they're learning. It's especially true in math. One of the things about Montessori math is that because of the use of materials, like I went in today to a primary classroom and this child was a second year primary student. He was working on something called the bead chain and the number chain, and he was doing numbers by seven, and he was well into the thousands. So kids in a Montessori math environment, because of the manipulatives, are dealing with very large numbers at a much earlier, and they're starting to understand the concept of dynamic addition and subtraction and multiplication. So again, they're not pushing them to learn it faster. They're learning it at their own pace, but it allows them to understand it really fully and conceptually. In terms of math, I think it's unbelievable the way kids can manipulate very large numbers at such a young age. And it's natural. It's not forced. And they're not just spouting it. They understand the concepts behind the numbers. So numeracy is phenomenal in Montessori.
So we're just about to wrap up here, but any other questions or anything that anyone would want to ask?
Great. I really appreciate people hanging in there. Thank you.
No, this has been super fun to connect with you, and we're so happy to have you as a resource and advisor. We've been really fortunate at C Rose to have such amazing advisors like Dr. Susan Zoll, who is a Montessorian who is now in higher ed. She's the head of the early childhood department at Rhode Island College, to connect with amazing Montessori teachers who are in the area and other Montessorians. We are actually really interested in connecting with people who are adults now who went through Montessori education, because we'd like to have a similar conversation, maybe a little bit shorter and a little more casual, to talk about what their experiences were like. We're hoping to bring on a couple more speakers like this. All right. We have one question. What can families do to collaborate or integrate Montessori into their home? Great question. Thank you, Miss Rebecca, who's our other primary teacher who is on the Facebook live chat.
All the materials are now pretty much, you can purchase them and bring into your home, but you have to know how to use them. So I think one of the things about Montessori at home is taking the practical skills that the child has learned and allowing them to do it at home. In other words, making sure as a parent, you're not doing things for kids at home that they should be doing themselves. To me, that will be a huge piece. I know you can buy the materials, but I think it's hard to teach those materials, especially if you're not a trained teacher. It would be good to reinforce it at home because the kids will know how to use the materials, especially as they get older. I always feel like church and state, there should be a little bit of a separation between home and school. There's always that famous saying, kids act differently at home and school. So as long as they're wonderful and joyful kids in school, we're not really worried about how they act at home.
It's 7 o'clock on the dot. So let's end.
Okay.
And thank you so much. And feel free, if you have any questions, you can email hello@crosemontessori.com if you're not already in touch with Miss Jess. It's easier to email hello@crosemontessori.com than to spell out Miss Jess's email, but she's amazing. She helps with getting all the observations and getting parents set up so that you can come and visit and meet our amazing teachers. And we look forward to seeing you, and we look forward to seeing you in another event like this too.